Okay, it's 10:30 Eastern. I will begin. Thanks for having me. Good morning, good afternoon, or evening if you're tuning in from another place in the world. Before we begin, I just want to see a show of hands. I have a couple of vocab words for you. So with regards to software development, who knows what the word localization means? Localization. Okay, almost everybody in this room. And I trust some of you online are raising your hands remotely. Okay, who knows what the word internationalization means? Okay, so same amount of people, a little bit more nervous raising of hands. Here's the kicker. Who knows what the difference between these two terms is? Not as many people, right? Yeah, that's totally okay. A lot of people use these two terms interchangeably, but they actually don't mean the same thing, and you're going to need to discern the difference between them to fully grasp the talk. So I'll just get out of the way and quickly define both of them for you. So localization, or L10N for short, because software engineers are lazy and abbreviate everything. Localization is the adaptation of an application to meet the needs of a given locale. So this most obviously entails translation of text into the common language of that locale. If you're in Thailand, you probably want to read Thai. If you're in France, you probably want to read French. If you're on the USS Enterprise, maybe you want to read, I don't know, Klingon. But it entails more than just translation of strings. You can think also about the legal requirements for the region or currency of the region. For example, in the US, we obviously use the US dollar. In Germany, they use the euro, and in Sweden, the krona. You can think about numeric or date time formats. In English, we separate thousands by a comma when printing a number. The same thing is done in German, but with a period, and in Swedish, space is used. So these are just a few of a multitude of variables that you have to consider when you're looking to localize your application for a given region. So that's localization. Internationalization, or I18N for short, is the product or the tooling that enables localization of an application to occur. So to use an analogy, if you look at localization as a chair that was built in a wood shop, you could think of internationalization as the saw and the hammer that were used to build that chair, or even the wood shop itself. Does that make a little more sense? Cool. Well, now that we got that out of the way, I just want to take a quick trip back to the recent past. The date is March 2nd, 2022, and the Spotify for Artists web application has been localized into 25 different non-English first locales around the world. It's been only 2 weeks since our latest shipment of locales, but in that short time, we've already seen that 35% of users are now on a non-English experience. So that's over a third of users of S4A are on a non-English experience. Retention of non-English first is at 83%. So once we flipped on these locales, people in those regions immediately automatically received the new experience, and we gave them the option of switching back to English if they so chose. 83% chose to stay with the new experience. So as you can see, existing users who are already with us are not only using these new experiences we've provided, an application tailored to the language they speak and the culture they live in, but new users are flocking to the application. Sorry, make a noise, 1 sec. New users are flocking to the application since we made these localized experiences available. So in short, localization really does matter. It matters for our users and for the potential users of our application. So how did we get to such a successful localized experience in S4A? Well, first of all, it was an incredibly valiant effort spanning all of the feature teams that contribute to the pieces of Spotify for Artists. But before that began, we had to work really hard and think really hard about how to build good internationalization tooling that would make the process of localization as intuitive as possible. So my name is Josh Hatcher, and I'm a web engineer on the Chameleon Squad. Was once the Platypus Squad. We like animals. And we own the Market Web repository where the Spotify for Artists web application lives. And in 2021 and 22, we were charged with building the IT and infrastructure that would be used to localize the features in S4A. And today I want to talk to you about, one, how the process for localizing the pieces of Spotify for Artists works using that I18N tooling. Two, I want to talk to you about the ITN tooling itself, how it's set up, and how the API works. And three, I want to talk about how you, if you're a web engineer at Spotify who may not even work in the SRA application or have any interest in touching it, if you work in a web application at Spotify, you can use this ITN tooling that we built. We've made it available in library form, and so it's really never truly been easier than now to localize web applications at Spotify. And trust me, your users will thank you for it. So, when Platypus started architecting the ITN infrastructure for SFRA, we had some important considerations to make. And the first group of considerations related to the end users, the creators, the artists, the labels that would be actually using the application itself. We had to make sure that their experience would be as genuine as possible. And so that meant not relying on translations that were generated by a machine. If we could do that, we could just let Google Translate do the job for us, right? Now remember that localization is more than just translation of strings, but even when you think about translations, you have some important considerations to make. You have to think about the context and the nuance that a string exists in. For example, I could say the sentence, "The boy threw the ball," and you're all human, you can probably intuit what I'm trying to say. There's a boy with a spherical object tossing it with his arm. But technically speaking, the word ball has more than one meaning. It could be a spherical object, could be a fancy party. So technically speaking, the boy could be playing baseball. He could also be throwing a gala. Renaissance man, old soul. So do we feel comfortable letting a machine make this call for us? No, of course not. We need real human beings to make these calls for us. And that's exactly what we do. Every snippet of text you see in the Spotify for Artists application has actually been uploaded to a service called Smartling, where real human translators that are contracted by the Spotify localization program access them and translate those strings into the 25 different non-English languages that we support. So the other batch of considerations that we had to take into account had to do with the engineers of the feature teams that were going to be localizing these features. These are technically Platypus's direct customers, and we had to make sure that their experience using the ITN tooling would be as smooth as possible. So this involved having to come up with a clearly defined process for requesting and generating translations. We worked with the localization program at Spotify to do that. We had to provide good documentation for that process. And within reason, without compromising the experience of the end user, we had to think about how we could incorporate automation into the process so there wouldn't be a lot of manual steps to remember and potentially mess up. So what does that process even look like? This is kind of a rough flow chart of how it works. You can think of the red box at the top as step one. Step one is that feature teams, engineers on feature teams will wrap every snippet of text and all their files in a function. So each string of text becomes an argument for this function, which I'll talk about in a bit. Step two, yellow, on CI build, a script runs that checks every instance of this function in the code base and copies the strings into a central JSON file, which is then uploaded to Smartling, the service that I mentioned earlier. Step three, green, translations of the strings are made by the translators. They access them, and translators for each of the 25 different languages create translations. They end up in locale-specific files, so one file for each locale with all the strings in them and the translations. Step four, those files are downloaded back into the code base after a certain period of time. And lastly, purple, when the end user switches their locale, the function that these strings is wrapped in flips the translation to the language that is associated with that locale. And at a high level, it's actually really as simple as this. And I only have a half an hour here, so I'm not going to go over every line of code, but I do want to dig in a little deeper and show you a little bit further how the ITN tooling works. So when we start talking about how the tooling works, we can think about context. You can think of a context as a bubble, and everything in that bubble has access to a thing. In this case, that thing is the ITN translation API. In our case, this is just a simple React context, if you know how to use React. we have a function called create I18N, which is exported by our I18N tooling that generates an I18N instance. An instance is just an object that is able to be initialized, and it has some configuration specific to this app's I18N setup. So one of the most pertinent factors in that setup is where to load translations in from. Remember, I mentioned that we download a file with all the strings translated into a language, one for each language. We need to know where those files exist in so we can load in the translations. So we generate a context, we spin up our I18N instance, pass it to the value of the context, and then we can wrap our app in that context. That's the bubble, and we have access to the tooling, or to the translations API. Here's kind of a simplified look at how it's roughly set up in Spotify for Artists. So we load in our dependencies, we create this context using the React create context function, loading in just a default value for it. And then we have this component that wraps our app. First line of it, we call create I18N with some configuration to get our I18N instance. We pass that instance to the value of the context provider, and the context provider is wrapping our app. And so everything inside our app has access to the translation API. So now I'm going to talk about that translations API. I mentioned that feature teams wrapped all of their strings in a function. So that function we call T. T stands for translation. And you can access it via a React hook called useT. So you call useT, you get your T function. And it's used to wrap all the strings. And the API for the T function looks something like this. 4 arguments, 3 required and 1 optional. The first argument is a unique ID for the string. So this can be anything, but this ID has to be unique to the string because it's going to be the key that we use to access the string in the various translation files. The second argument is the string itself that we want to translate. Third argument is a description of the string, and this is sort of a contextual explanation for what it is for our translators. Remember the boy threw the ball argument, so the translators have as much context as they need. And the fourth and optional argument is an interpolated values object, and you can use this to pass in some fields that you might want embedded in your string. For example, if I've got an artist name in my component and I want that to be embedded somewhere in the string, you can set it to interpolated values and then put it in the string inside of curly braces. So here's this is probably the simplest example of how you could set up a component using the translation API. I've got just a simple React component that returns a div with hello world inside. So I call my useT function, I get my T, and then just inline in the JSX, I call the T function, I give it this unique ID, say hello. It can be anything as long as it's unique. Second argument is hello world, the string itself. And third argument tells our translators this is just a simple snippet of text to greet the user on the landing page. Here's a slightly more advanced version of the same example. So say our component gets in the currently logged in user's name as a prop. So in this case, we still call the useT function at the top to get our T. And in this case, we have the same example, except we're using our fourth argument, the interpolated values. We pass the username in as a field to that object, and then within our string, we can reference that field in curly braces. So now if my name is Josh, I'm using the application, instead of hello world, it'll say hello Josh in the UI. And I should mention also, if no translations are found for this string, then it'll just default to the second argument. So you never get any empty UI. At the very least, you'll get the English string. So we have all our strings wrapped in the T function. Now, how do we actually get the translations, right? We don't have them yet. So a script runs on CI, which you can also run locally, and it steps through the entire S4A app node by node, and it looks for instances of this T function. And when it finds them, it copies the arguments, the contents, into this central file, which is then shipped off to SmartLink. So here's the hello world example that we had earlier. When the string extraction script runs, it's going to find this instance, and it's going to create a field in this central JSON object to send to SmartLink. The key is the unique ID. Again, like that's the reference to the strings that we can use to get our translations. And then the value is an object with 2 fields. the string itself, and the description. And then that's shipped off to SmartLang where the translators can access it. Once the translators are done, we can download the translation files back into the app. So remember in the beginning I said your IETN instance has to tell the application where to load translations from. So in this case, we're assuming that we told them to load them from a folder, source translations, and then a locale code specific folder. So when we download them back, we get a strings.json file inside of the EN folder, which has the English strings, one inside the ES folder, which contains Spanish, one in the JP folder, which contains Japanese, and so on and so forth. So here, I'm going to do a quick demo of how this actually looks in the Spotify for Artists app now, if you're using it. This is the SFRA homepage. It's on my music page, and it's in English. And if I go to this trigger here, I can change the language. I'm going to change it to Finnish. Now you see the same UI, but all the strings are in Finnish. And this works for non-Latin alphabets as well. I can switch to Greek, and now the whole app is in Greek. And every string of text you see here has actually been translated by a real human being who's fluent in Greek. That's a good question. Yeah, that'll get resolved early because you'll get an error when you run the script. It'll tell you there's already a string with a unique ID. Good question. So here's an example using a right to left language. So remember how I said that localization is more than just translations of strings. If you're using a right to left language, the whole experience of the application has to flow or navigate from right to left to accommodate that region, the culture. So we also support Arabic and Hebrew. So here's an example of switching to Arabic. On the Spotify for Artists app, we have this drawer that appears on the left on English, which shows all your artists. So if I go up and I switch to Arabic, then not only the language, but the whole experience is switched from right to left. So that drawer is now on the right. You see your artist avatars are flushed to the right of the names. And we do that through translating our CSS from physical properties into logical properties. Basically means that instead of referencing a specific explicit direction of your container, you talk about the start and the end of that container. So border top becomes border block start. That's sort of a script that runs to transform that CSS. So the string extraction script also generates a JSON file for translations into a fake pseudo language. And this is just so feature teams can test their work locally. You know, if they have localized their app, they did their due diligence, but they don't have translations yet, but they want to check that they use the API correctly. The string extraction script basically takes all those English strings and mutates them into this fake language using special characters and accents, and then puts that pseudo translation file in its locale specific folder. A backdoor way of changing your locale in the Spotify for Artists app is to append the locale code to the end of the URL after the C here. So for this, FR is at the end of the URL, so I would be given the French experience. So if I was on a feature team and I just finished localizing my feature and I want to test it out, I'd run that string extraction script, and in my dev environment, I could switch to the URL with the word pseudo at the end, and that would give me something like this. So as you can see, the strings sort of look like English, but they have some extra characters and some weird accents around, and so you know that the app is being translated into this fake language, that the translation API is working correctly. Yeah, so like if you went up here, if I just localized the nav and I didn't use something went wrong, then I would probably just see the strings in English. But since the translation functionality is working, it's being flipped into the pseudo locale. So I know if once I get my translations back and I switch the locale to something else, I'll get that equivalent string in the different language. Good question. So This is all well and good, but I'm sure you're wondering, what does this have to do with me? And I promise I'm not just showing you this to show you or to show off Spotify for Artists. It's also because you can actually use this ITN tooling yourself that we built wherever you work at Spotify now. We've moved the tooling into library form in 2 different libraries. The libraries are called I18N Core and I18N String Extraction. And the former contains the translation API, the useT function, and the code that you need to create a I18N context to wrap your app in. The latter of which contains the command to run your string extraction script. So if you're interested and you are a web engineer on a project, totally check out these projects, read the documentation, reach out to me or my squad at Chameleon Squad Public. I'd be happy to help you and answer any questions. And if you are thinking of localizing your application, you will definitely want to get in touch with the localization program at Spotify, which you can reach at Localization on Slack. And they'll help you talk through the scope of the work, the technical landscape, roadmap. They can get you access to SmartLing and just make sure that you have all the proper integrations. And if you do this, you could have a success story like we did. Remember these numbers? Remember these happy kids? Existing users that were able to use the app before are using these experiences that we provided. New users who maybe weren't able to use the website before because they didn't speak English are now using the experience. So I just want to close by driving home the point again, and that's that localization matters. It really matters. It's about accessibility, it's about inclusion, and it's about allowing more people from different cultures who might speak a different language than you to use your application. And this is obviously better for you because you've got more users, more traffic, but it's also just simply the right thing to do. Spotify is where people go for the entire history of recorded music, and a non-localized experience in Spotify for Artists could mean shutting out a lot of amazing music from cultures or individuals who don't speak English. And a localized experience means more music from more different cultures and hopefully a chance to give people exposure to a more diverse range of art and human experience. Thank you.